Welcome to the Enneagram 2.0 podcast. I'm Beatrice Chestnut.
And I'm Uranio Paes.
And today we are talking about typing and mistyping, but mostly about mistyping. How people often have trouble finding their type and also get confused in finding their type and even sometimes think they're one type for a period of time before realizing that's not actually their real type.
Yeah, and there are many reasons behind people mistyping, both self and others. Many different reasons. And the first thing I guess I would like to say is that it's harder to find your type on the Enneagram than it is in other models, other simpler models. When you find your right type, the kind of thing that the Enneagram gives you is not to be compared with any other model, in my view. But finding out your type is not the easiest thing. And sometimes people think they have found it, but not really.
Yes, it's definitely a bit of a barrier to entry for people interested in the Enneagram. It can be sometimes a little frustrating, or sometimes it can just be hard to know. Like, how do I discover my type in a way that really works? And I think we hear from a lot of people when we're teaching a lot of questions around, can you say the difference between this type and this type? Or how do I know if I'm this type? And so I think one of the reasons why we decided to do this podcast on this topic is to really help people not only find their type, because people who already know their type may be listening to this and may find this interesting, but really to kind of dive down a little bit into what happens when people mistype themselves. You know, why is it legitimately difficult to really settle on your main type? And how can you avoid some mistypings? And how can you start to think about this in a way that really helps guide you to the type that you really are?
Yes, and there is this whole business of trying to find someone else's type. When you know your type already, it's almost unavoidable to start thinking of what someone else's type is. And sometimes, people you know in your life, but other times public figures. And it's also not very easy because when we see public figures, we see just what they show in public. But also, let me say that even Enneagram specialists very rarely are aligned when it comes to saying the type of celebrity or a politician. I actually thought that Trump would be the first person that we would have total alignment, because to me, he felt more obvious, like him being an eight, a sexual eight. But even for him, I didn't see that.
You thought that everyone would see how clearly he was, what
Yes.
type he was, but so many people didn't agree that he was an eight and had other ideas. And I agree, that surprised me a lot too. And again, we need to say whenever we talk about typing celebrities that, I think the main thing is that you don't get too 100% certain that when obviously you don't. We don't know for certain what type Trump is. But I think sometimes if we've been studying the Enneagram a long time, we can have an educated guess, especially if we marshal evidence to make an argument. And so I think that there's plenty of evidence to suggest what type Trump might be. But as you said, we were really surprised that people disagreed. But one more thing I want to say about Trump before we move on, and I do want to hear whatever else you have to say about this. But I think Trump, sometimes you and I talk about the repressed instinct. And I think he's also a great example of, potentially, if we're right about him, someone who has a social repressed instinct, someone who doesn't always know how what he says is going to impact the larger group. And certainly I think he has his finger on the pulse of a certain element of his audience, but there's so many things that he's said that I think have upset so many people, and sometimes people who are socially repressed eh, do that.
Yeah, from my side, it's just that when he became president and was more prominent, I just thought, finally there is someone that all of us Enneagram teachers will agree about the type, and I was completely wrong. So after that, I just gave up because it's not possible to have agreement. And I must say, there are different takes on the Enneagram, different perspectives, depending on the teacher, the school, what people see to type, how they type. So it's a complex matter. So, in a way, I think that on this podcast today, we'll add a few more pieces on what you and I believe is a good method of typing, and something we've been trying to incorporate in our CP Enneagram Academy.
Yes, we'll say a few things about what we think it's important to keep in mind when trying to find your type, but then we'll spend most of our time talking about how mistyping happens, how you can avoid it, and some of the common mistypes of the types first, and then looking at some subtype information and how that can actually help us avoid mistyping.
Yeah, and just before we go there, I just want to add one more piece. I personally get really frustrated when I read some Facebook groups about the Enneagram, when people are trying to type someone or talking about how do I know my type. And it's so much information I don't agree with that I not even know where to start, and it would take me so much time to do anything about it. And it's all there for anyone to see, and so there is a whole problem of disinformation for people when they go to social media when it comes to typing. I think that on Facebook groups, people speculate about someone's type, about how do I know my type when someone asks that question, and or when someone says I'm in a doubt between this, and that, these three types, and then an avalanche of answers come up that are all things I don't agree with, and I wouldn't even know how to start to offer another view because it's so much and it's everywhere that I give up. And to be very honest, I don't have much patience anymore for that. So I just think it's important for you who's listening to us now to understand that out there in social media, there is a lot of information that B and I don't consider particularly reliable.
Yes, and I do think when we're talking about mistyping, we will be drawing on our personal experience of working with people. I still do typing interviews, and I really enjoy doing typing interviews. And I love the people I meet when I do typing interviews because often they're people who seek me out because they've been struggling for a while to really feel a secure sense of knowing what type they are. And I hear a lot of different stories. And I think when you're trying to type yourself, the first thing, of course, people want to do is take a test. And it's important to know that most of the tests out there are not very accurate, and even some of the best tests can be wrong. So, of course, it makes sense that you want to take a test. Sometimes it's just for fun, but it's very important to not give over your authority to know who you are or define yourself to a test. Too often, it's a little bit like when we have a problem, we want to take a pill and we want it to go away. We want the test to give us the answer. And that short circuits the very important self reflection process that I think is the opening stage or the first stage of learning about yourself through the Enneagram. That typing process should be something that is undertaken mindfully, and that you see as the important, you know, kind of engagement with yourself to find your type that actually is really good. So try not to go to a test immediately if you're still looking for your type. Although if you do take a test, that's fine. Just look at it as one piece of data, and not the defining answer of all time. And of course, some of the tests are bar graphs, and they can say there are 3 or 4. I saw this on Facebook the other day. There are 3 or 4 types that are all 100% or 99% you. And so that makes it a little bit difficult too. But what else would you say about the typing process? I have a few more things to say, but I'd like to hear your thoughts.
Yeah, I really liked what you said about tests, and there is a particular way that our brain works, which is when we say yes to something, we tend to stop being critical about it, and we start trying to validate that hypothesis, all the time instead of staying critical. And when you approach the Enneagram, try to stay critical, try to stay questioning yourself. And that includes your type, because it's good to keep investigating all the time. When you are confident about your type, then it's fine to simply stay with that and go along with it, especially if a good teacher is also comfortable with you saying that you are that type. But it's also good to know how difficult the job of typing is, and keep an eye open.
And since you've mentioned teachers, I want to mention something that I hear a lot in terms of how people get mistyped, and that is through teachers or Enneagram coaches. I hear a lot of stories of someone who early on in the process of trying to find their type went to an Enneagram coach, someone who specializes in it. And I just think there are a lot of people out there using the Enneagram who maybe don't know it at a deep enough level to type people with skill and precision, but don't know that they don't know enough. I think most people are very well intentioned. But for instance, I hear a lot of stories like, early on, I went to a coach and I thought I was this type. For instance, I thought I was a 2, but then this coach asked me, are you patient? And I said, no, I'm very impatient. And she said, oh, well, then you can't be a 2. 2s are patient. And when I hear that, I think, well, that's a little bit weird because I think 2s can be patient or impatient, and many 2s are impatient. I know for me as a 2, I've had to work at being patient. I would say I can be patient now, but I sometimes can be very impatient. And when I am patient, it's usually through a lot of effort, and when I get there, I wouldn't say it comes naturally. So I think there's a way, and I've heard again a lot of versions of this story. I went to an Enneagram coach, and they said I couldn't be a 4 because I don't have this characteristic, and I think to myself, well, that characteristic isn't necessarily definitional of a 4, and especially what that person said. So I think sometimes people fix on like one specific question that determines, no, you can't be this type, when that specific question or issue or topic is not the core definitional. Like you can go either way and still be that type. I think there are some really core definitional things, and we'll probably mention those as we go along, that if you don't have it, then you probably aren't this type. But there are a lot of different things that aren't that hard and fast. And so I think we need to be aware of those. And when I'm helping someone type themselves, and I'm listening very carefully to what they're saying about themselves, I just think there's so much nuance on so many different factors that we have to really have a good ear. And I think if you use a typing consultant or teacher or coach, you need to check the person's credentials. How long have they been doing it? How long have they been working on themselves using the Enneagram? Where did they get their training? All of these questions are really important. And even if you have an experience with a teacher, coach that you like or that you think is good, again, don't even take that as the final answer. Keep open and really make yourself the final authority on what type you are, and especially in consultation with people who know you well. I think I hear a lot of good stories about people who say, well, I didn't see this trait in me, and maybe it's like a 9 who says, I didn't think I was conflict avoidant, but I talked to my best friend and my best friend said, oh yes, I think you're conflict avoidant. I see you avoiding conflict all the time.
I think that teachers need to look at their power shadows, because they sometimes lead us teachers to concluding something too easily and nailing down type for people, which is not a good idea, even if you're right, because the process of someone finding out their type brings an aha moment that is unique. And let the person somehow find out their type and interfere a bit more only when it's truly needed, because the person isn't going anywhere. And if you know that some teachers don't have enough information, for instance, about subtypes, or don't have enough experience to see the subtleties sometimes, then it is dangerous if you just follow what a teacher say. And the best Enneagram teachers are humble about saying what someone's type is, and they go for validation of different kinds, and the ultimate validation is the person's validation. So that is very important. Teachers, when teaching the Enneagram, should not be the gurus.
Right, and I think you said the most important thing is I think teachers and coaches that work with the Enneagram need to have a measure of humility. There needs to be an ability to stay a little bit open to potentially being wrong, and especially not saying something hard and fast without exploring it in a deeper way. For instance, another example is one time I met this woman at a training, and her Enneagram coach had told her that she was a 6 and that she couldn't be a 7. And turns out this woman was a social 7, and a very clear one at that, in my view. And so there is a way that I think sometimes all of us, we just don't know what we don't know. And because of that, it's important to stay a little bit open and a little bit humble, especially open to learning more. Um, and for instance, you and I use the subtypes in everything we do, the Naranjo approach to the subtypes, as I call it. And I think one of the things that has helped me do is add a lot more nuance to my typing process when I'm helping guide someone to find their correct type, because the 9 categories are a little bit broad when we're talking about really understanding individual characteristics. And for instance, I've met a lot of 4s who don't relate to the social 4 description. So for instance, they don't really relate to being melancholy or living a lot in sadness. And that's a little bit more of the social 4, but people don't recognize that there's a self-preservation 4 that's different and a one-to-one or sexual 4 that's different in a different way. And so when people don't know the subtypes, that impacts their ability, I think, to skillfully type people. And if you go to one of those people, but they don't know what they don't know, and especially if they aren't open to maybe learning more and more to broaden their skill base, sometimes again, they may be bringing a certain mindset to the typing process that doesn't fully allow the deeper exploration that I think is kind of necessary when we're trying to find our type.
Yeah, and subtype is a very important dimension to take into account to type correctly. And I would also add, the instincts. And we had different podcasts talking about instincts and subtypes already. I just think that when we don't take these other dimensions of the Enneagram into account, we make lots of mistakes. And it's good to understand that. But just a bit more back to the, teacher bias at times. Some people try to type their friends, even though they are not teachers. And this is totally fine. So just make sure that you ask the person many questions instead of making affirmations, and make sure that you also have the person validate or not what you're saying after you say what what is the type you believe the person may be. And it's not because you're not a teacher that you shouldn't be concerned with accuracy and that humble side that we talked about. So if you multiply somehow and spread the word of the Enneagram, it's important to bear all of this in mind, even if you don't teach this system.
Exactly. Exactly. And I think sometimes it can be a fun thing to do to talk about what type your friend might be. So it's not that you shouldn't do it. I think it's just uh, to, like you're saying, ask a lot of questions and don't assume you know things unless you've really checked it out with the person. And so I think to sort of sum up, I think if you're trying to type yourself, the best thing, of course, to do is to read sort of authoritative type descriptions of what type you might be. In the back of my book, The Complete Enneagram, there's an appendix that compares every pair of types in terms of how they're similar, but how they're also different. So sometimes that can help because we get like a lot of questions like that, like what's the difference between a 9 and a 4, and can 9s and 4s sometimes mistype themselves as each other? And of course that's true. But sometimes I think people need some good information about how are these types similar and how are they different. And it's important, I think, sometimes to ask yourself an either or question. Am I like this or am I like that? Because there are types, most types, even when they're lookalikes, have some things that are really opposite about them as well.
Yeah, and basically beware of simplistic, uh, too general, and also stereotype descriptions of types that exist out there. Avoid them.
Exactly. And again, I think the reasons why, again, to sum it up, that people get mistyped, which happens all the time. And by the way, if you have mistyped yourself, or if you were spent some time as one type, um, you know, that's totally understandable. It's normal. As we've said many times, finding your type should be seen as a process, and sometimes thinking you're one type that you end up not being is part of your process. So there's there's no right or wrong about any of this. But I will say some of the reasons why I think people get mistyped, and then I want to hear what you think about this, if there's anything you would add to the list. One thing is that there are especially behavioral traits, but traits that different types share in common. Right? So, for instance, 2s and 9s are a common mistyped because 2s and 9s share many traits in common. They both seek to be helpful, they both avoid conflict, they both focus their attention primarily outside themselves on other people or what's going on in the outside world. As opposed to inside themselves. Sometimes they don't know what they want or need, or it's hard to access what's going on inside. It can be hard to make decisions sometimes. So lookalike characteristics are a big reason, and there's a lot of lookalikes. 2s can look like 7s, 3s and 8s can look alike. 9s and 7s can look alike. 5s and 1s can look alike. 4s and 6s can look alike. There's a lot of lookalikes if we look at some of the traits, not all of them, of each type. So it's important to recognize that it's normal to have some sense of confusion when finding your type, because you might really hear something about one type and say, "Oh, I'm exactly like that." But the important thing is to remember, well, maybe there are other things about that type that you don't relate to also. So try not to also fix on one big characteristic. Try to take a more holistic view of each type and really be honest with yourself about what you relate to and what you don't. Now, second thing, sometimes we can think we relate to something or think we don't relate to something about a given type, but it's a blind spot, right? Either we think we're a way we're not, sometimes because we'd like to be seen that way, or we don't own something that is true about us. So sometimes sevens will say, well, I don't relate to that trait sevens have, or that is described in Enneagram books, saying that sevens avoid pain and that's why they pursue pleasure or enjoyment or what's positive. And it's a blind spot in sevens that they're actually moving away from or pushing away painful emotions. And so some sevens just won't relate to that. So it's important to always keep in mind the question of, is this a blind spot? Is there something I'm not seeing about myself? And that's why I think, especially if you have people in your life that know you well, that you really trust, it's good to ask them, but again, don't give that person the final authority either. Maybe just ask them about something or something else, because I've also heard people mistype themselves and say, well, my friend agrees, my friend thinks I'm this type, and so she knows me well, and so that must be the truth. So again, take in the feedback from people who you know and trust, who know you well, but don't give them the final authority either.
Right. Yeah. I also believe that we always need to include motivation behind behavior, and not only behavior. We need to take it into account to get to a more accurate typing. It's not very easy for people who don't practice self observation, but it's a great exercise, and it is important when we define type. It's the why I do that, and not only the what I do. So there are similar things that different types do, the lookalikes that you talked about, but usually the motivation behind that is quite different. And if you understand motivation, then you'll understand something very important to become skillful in typing. I also believe, that there are some rules for good typing, and they are: don't consider only the current moment you have in your life. Consider your life as a whole, as a process, and all moments of life. Also, don't think of yourself as you are in one area of your life, just at work or just in your relationships, and try to see yourself in all those areas. So those are two rules. I also like to watch for what sometimes I call the wannabes. Like, is this really who you are, or who you try to be, or who you would like to be? And it's great to think like this. If you are in a doubt between two types, ask yourself which one describes things that are really natural for me, meaning that I have never needed to make an effort to do that. And it's still most probably my first reaction. And then I control myself not to do it at times. But this is your type. Your type is not the other case that you have been trying to become, you have developed to be able to do. So it's what comes from factory. It's like,
From the factory, yeah.
yeah, it's like the very original you needs to be seen as your type. And of course, there is the thing about people who have been doing inner work of any kind, and people have changed, people who have changed because of that. So it's a good idea to look back and see how you used to be before you started doing inner work.
And I know that sometimes people say, should we look at how we were in our 20s, for instance, those of us who are beyond our 20s. And I don't think it's like just 20s. I think it's like you're saying, I think it's look at your life as a whole. If you ask some of these questions, there should be an answer of like, yes, this is what I've normally been like most of my life. I do think it's important not to look at just what you're like now, especially if you've made a big self growth effort in the last 5 years, let's say. That said, I do think that some things are really hard to change that completely. Like I've heard people say, "Oh, I'm an evolved 8." Well, an evolved 8 is maybe an unevolved 2, and they're actually a 2, something like that. So it's really important to know that we do change, we do grow. But some of these underlying trends, like you said, the core motivations, which are so important, they don't change that much over time. It's still there. Now, that said, some of the sort of surface things get sanded down or get changed. And that's why it's important to look at what's been my main underlying coping strategy over the course of my life. Don't just look at when you were 18 or 24, but look at the overall trend in your life. And if you have changed lately, sometimes what can be good to look at is, okay, if you've made a big change effort, what's that change been about? Because sometimes when I'm doing typing interviews, I'll hear people say, oh, well, no, I do that less and less. Right. And I'm thinking, okay, so you've had to try to do that less and less. That's been an issue. And so the main answer is you do this, but you've worked on it and now you do it less. So listening for what you've had to work on, what has changed, and not just looking at the changed state or where you are now in a superficial way, but underneath, like what have you worked on and why have you worked on, and what were you like before you worked on that? Recognizing again that some things, even when we work on them a lot, won't change completely because these are deeply rooted habitual patterns that we're dealing with.
Yeah, and one thing that sometimes I like to ask regarding what you've just said is if the person keeps having a first impulse like before, even if that doesn't become a behavior that is communicated to others. So that might be a good idea, thinking of your first impulses.
Yes, and I think we can't say often enough that we often get confused because there are certain ways we'd like to see ourselves, or it's kind of like what you said about the wannabe, or ways that we would like other people to see us. And one of the important things about self observation that you touched on is the whole reason that one of the main and first methodologies connected to the Enneagram is self observation, is that when we really make a very consistent, mindful effort to really observe what we're doing, what we often find is we don't really know ourselves as well as we think we do. We may hold a certain idea in our mind about what we're like, but we haven't really looked at ourselves lately and said, am I really like that? Or am I different, but I just kind of want to or need to see myself that way?
Yeah, perfect. Um, and I guess I also want to comment on something about the motivation. I said that it's important to consider the motivation behind behavior, but how to do that? And I'd say that if you listen to two podcasts of ours here on Enneagram 2.0, you will get to that. And they are the podcasts about the subtypes and the podcast about the passions of each type. I think those two explain really well where some of the main motivations of a type come from and what they are type by type. So try to consider passion, subtype, and later on you could also include what we call the fixation, and we'll sometime do a podcast on that also.
And we also did a podcast on countertypes. And what we find is often when people have really struggled to find their type over a period of time, when it's a bit harder for them to feel secure about their type, they end up being a countertype. And the countertype is the one of the three subtypes of each type that's a bit upside down, that it doesn't look like what many people think that type looks like, because it kind of goes against the flow, especially of the passion, the core emotional motivation that colors so much of how the type shows up, but in a way that's often unconscious. So it will be good to consider those. And again, if you're someone who is still really trying to find their type, or thinks they might be mistyped, or is trying to help other people not mistype themselves, those might be good resources. So should we talk about the nine types and some common mistypes or common things that happen when they're trying to type themselves? Or is there anything left to say by way of introduction?
No, I think we're good to go. Let's talk about the 9 types.
Okay. So shall we start with 8 as we usually do?
Please do.
Okay. So what do you see in terms of type 8? How do you see eights mistyping themselves? What are some common issues that come up for eights when they're trying to find their type and they might get mistyped?
Well, I can mention a few. One is in certain cultures that do not value the typical 8 behavior of confrontation and sort of creating some conflict, then some 8s might resist a bit more to see that they are like that. And I'd say that in many cultures, this is even more common for women. Some women 8s sometimes don't see themselves as easily as men who are 8s. But in my experience, having taught in many different places, I believe this is very much related to culture. And another thing to me is that sometimes the very first reaction of 8s is to deny something. And that is part of what explains being an 8. And I've seen 8s saying, no, I'm not necessarily like that. No, no. And many times 8s say no as a first reaction, while they are still considering that they might be that, or that they agree with that, but they first say no at times. And it all depends on who's also trying to help them get typed. If the 8 is happy with the person or not, and if the 8 wants to be typed or not. But if it's about your own type that you are trying to identify, just beware of your tendency to deny content.
Yes, and again, a big blind spot for eights is vulnerability, and sometimes the typing process itself can feel vulnerable, uh, especially if other people are involved. So there can be an issue for eights in not wanting to reveal themselves as part of a typing process, or not wanting to let other people know something as personal as their Enneagram type. So there can be a little bit of a pushback on the typing process itself, or the self-discovery or the sharing of self that can sometimes be connected to that. But that said, I see eights sometimes mistyping as threes. I think especially social threes, and also occasionally as fives even. I've seen that happen a few times. Sometimes, usually it's the self-preservation eight that mistypes as a five. Um, and occasionally also there's a confusion of between 8 and 1. And again, especially, and I'm noticing it's hard for me not to bring the subtypes in right away, but especially the sexual one can look a lot like an eight. And I think sexual ones sometimes get mistyped as eights, but eights sometimes can get mistyped as ones in my experience.
Yeah, and as you said before, there are so many different mistyping cases that at this point you and I have seen multiple times, each type being mistyping for all the other eight types. So sometimes, a social weight thinking they might be a two also, so many other cases. So bear in mind that, all kinds of mistyping can happen.
Yeah, I think that's probably one of the ones I see the most is a social eight who thinks they're a two, sometimes a nine, because the social eight isn't as obviously aggressive or in touch with anger or expressing anger. And especially, again, if it's a woman, sometimes women have been conditioned to not show anger or not be too assertive. Um, that's not okay, and so sometimes that can get in the way of an eight woman, for instance, knowing that she's an eight. Anything else to say about eights before we move on? I think one more thing I'm remembering I want to say about eights is I notice more and more I see sometimes sexual eights getting mistyped as fours, or especially sexual four, because those two types can look very similar, or sometimes the sexual four getting mistyped as an eight.
Yeah,
So I
that's
think
also
those two,
common. I
yeah.
agree
So I
with
think
you. And
I want.
yeah, one more thing from my side. I think that sometimes aides who have been making efforts to not explode and to contain a little bit, they also may think that they are not aides because of their current moment. But you need to see, all the moments in your life and your first impulse.
I think another thing that can get in the way of eights recognizing themselves as eights is the sense that they don't always know how they impact others. And so they may not realize or own some of the aspects that are assigned to eights that are sort of on the list of traits. So that can be another thing that gets in the way. But let's talk about nines. What would you say about nines? How do nines get mistyped? What issues are there in nines finding themselves?
I think sometimes nines get carried away by other types' descriptions. So one pattern to watch out for is when nines think that they have features of all nine types. And that is sometimes a tendency and sometimes a sign that the person might be a nine. Because I see myself being like that or like that. And the more I listen to descriptions, the more I got confused. That is a nine feature at times, and it's important to know that it's not even that nines adapt as an image game, but they may absorb a certain feature of the environment, people who are with them, and they may just go along to get along. And then it's important to know that if you are a nine, you have this tendency of seeing yourself in all other nine types, and that almost helps validate you as a nine.
Yes, it's often the nine that relates to all the types or really sees themselves in two or three or four types. And even sometimes I've seen nines who kind of think they are nines. All of a sudden they'll say, well, wait a minute. No, actually, maybe I'm a four, or actually I'm a six. So it's hard for nines, I think, to really land often and to give up the sense that they might be another type, because nines are so good at putting themselves really deeply in the shoes of somebody else. And especially, I think, if they've had important people in their lives of different types, sometimes it can be hard for them to really let go of the possibility of being that other type because they really relate to some of those characteristics. And often nines, of course, have trouble really knowing who they are from the inside, of accessing information about themselves in a way that makes them feel more secure in a kind of decision about this is who I am.
Yeah. And then we need to say that many other people who are not nines are conflict avoidant. And that doesn't guarantee that a person is a nine. Maybe nines are the ones who avoid conflict the most, and certainly the ones that get bothered with conflict the most. But most people out there of all types are conflict avoidant. So don't see only that aspect to make your decision.
And at the same time, it is a defining characteristic of nine. So in other words, if you're okay with conflict and you can even move toward it sometimes to really get it out there, you're probably not a nine, because that is a defining feature. And so I do think that nines have trouble, especially getting mistyped as twos. I think that's probably at the top of the list because nines and twos are very similar, especially on the outside, or especially at a certain level of description, as I mentioned before. But I also think nines sometimes get mistyped, interestingly, as fives. And I see this because I think sometimes they have a similar energy. There's a kind of a little bit of a laid backness, or both nines and fives, it's like their energy doesn't come out to get you. But of course nines and fives are a bit opposite in some ways as well. But what else would you say, what specific types do you see nines mistyping as, if any?
I think that one also many times because, some nines relate to that perfectionistic tendency, which even isn't always present on ones, but we say that that is more typical for ones. And nines think they are perfectionistic, and maybe many times more because of a somewhat obsessive tendency that makes them get engaged with routines and with processes. But it's different than ones because while they may be self-critical, they are not as self-critical as ones, like being extremely harsh on themselves. They may be even very self-critical, but not to that point. And definitely ones are more critical than other people than nines are.
Yeah, they're more critical or judgmental of others than nines. Yeah, I agree with you on that. And I do think too, sometimes, although nines can be quite self-critical, they often don't show it as much as ones. You don't see it leaking out very often. Like I'm often very surprised when I hear that my nine friend is so self-critical. But yeah, I think nines again probably have the most difficulty with mistyping, and so that may be that can often be a way of seeing the nine in them right there. But shall we move on to ones? Or should we talk a little bit about the subtypes of nine? I do think that social nines often mistype as twos or threes, because they tend to be very busy and more out there. I think sexual nines can mistype as fours often, sometimes twos or threes. And self preservation nines can sometimes seem a little eightish. I mean, probably not mistaken for eights very often, but a little bit, in that they can tend to have an energy about them that's that's quite powerful.
Yeah, this is a good summary, I'd say. And just the sexual nine might be the one that thinks the most that they may be all of the nine types. I think that's a
Right.
bit more typical of sexual nines.
Yes, because they merge the most.
If you're enjoying this episode, you will definitely enjoy the upcoming live online event, Avoiding Mistyping Pitfalls with Beatrice and Uranio. Participants can join live or watch the recording later. It's coming up this fall. Head to cpenneagram.com to get on our pre-registration list.
Okay, so let's talk about ones. I think that ones mistype the most, in my experience, as sixes or fives. I think sometimes I hear self-preservation ones mistyping as sixes in particular, because next to sixes, I think they have the most anxiety or worry, and it's hardest to throw that off for them. And I think social ones often relate to five a lot. But what would you say?
I think these are very common mistyping situations. Yeah. In some contexts, in business, I think ones might mistype as threes also, and vice versa. But yeah, I think those are common types. Now, what I observe, B, and it's funny, it's not very easy to explain or even to know why, but I think that ones sometimes are not willing to be discovered as ones. They resist a bit because of that, especially depending on who is investigating. I've seen ones being a bit stubborn when it comes to typing. And sometimes it's also because of the perfectionistic tendency. Like, are you sure? Do we need to see all that? And then the typical thing is, well, I read this list of 20 typical traits and I have 17 and a half, you know? And
Hmm.
this is something that I've seen many ones doing. And 17 and a half is a lot, but they think they see those two and a half that they don't see themselves as. So this is a little bit of a bias that can happen with ones.
Yes, and I think ones, especially when they're very new to the Enneagram, can be one of the types that are more skeptical. And in my experience, it's because at first the Enneagram may seem like just another thing that sort of they criticize themselves about, or that other people can see them through a critical lens. And it can feel a little bit vulnerable, or they can feel a little wary, like, okay, what's this thing that's going to evaluate me, or put me in a box? And ones can be very logical, and so they can need to sort of see the logic behind it before they really get it. But I also think that sometimes when ones find themselves, it's actually kind of a relief to have an explanation or have context around what can be a very painful experience of them criticizing themselves so much of the time.
Right. And what about the subtypes, B? What do you see as typical confusions?
Well, as we said, the self-preservation one gets confused with six, the social one gets confused with five, and I think the sexual one gets confused with eight, probably the most. Maybe sometimes sexual four, but especially eight. And I think especially if you have a teacher or a coach who doesn't know the approach to the subtypes that we use, um, you're more likely to, if you're a sexual one, to not be seen as a one. Because sometimes a sexual one can be so more out there with their anger and have their energy that's sort of more going out, have a bigger energy about them, and be more forceful. And sometimes I've seen those people get typed as eights if someone doesn't really know the nuances of the subtypes, and especially what the sexual one is all about.
Yeah, and I would just add that when the one person is self-preservation repressed in the instinctual sequence, this person may not see themselves as ones if the description that is being offered is stereotyping ones as being perfectionistic. That happens a lot.
That's really important. I can't tell you how many times I've heard someone say, well, I can't be a one because I'm not neat in every aspect of my life, or I'm not tidy, or I'm not completely organized. Every aspect of my life isn't totally in order. Or I've heard this one a lot. People have heard that ones are very particular about how the dishwasher gets loaded. And I'm not that way, so I can't be a one. And so again, that's a little too specific. There are certainly some ones that may not care how the dishwasher is loaded, and then of course there may be many who do, but that wouldn't be, I think, a defining characteristic. And ones themselves almost always say that they're not perfectionistic in every aspect of their life, even if they're the self-preservation one, which tends to be more perfectionistic than the other two. So shall we talk about twos?
Yeah, and you should start, obviously.
Okay. I did not mistype myself in the beginning. I was fortunate to learn it through one of the most important teachers, Enneagram teachers in the modern era, David Daniels, who told me he thought I was a two. And I looked it up and I was instantly completely convinced that that was my type. So that's just not my story. It doesn't make my story better or worse than anyone else's, but that's me. Now, twos, I actually have been surprised lately in that I've been doing a lot of typing interviews where someone ends up being a two, but for one reason or another, they didn't see it or were confused. Often it's when they're the self-preservation two, which is the counter type of two, which is my subtype. And this is because this is a two that has much more ambivalence about helping people, that doesn't necessarily look for people who need them. And so I think one of the things I want to say about this is, and I think this is important to keep in mind for mistyping, is watch out for stereotypes. Because I think one of the biggest things that leads to mistyping in all types is stereotypes. People have the idea of this type always does this, or this type is like this. And they don't recognize sometimes it's the subtype nuances, or they don't just recognize that that's a stereotype and it's not 100% true. And sometimes twos just want to look helpful. They don't actually want to be helpful. And I think that's especially true for the self-preservation too. And I've heard a lot of things like, well, someone told me that, if I wasn't super generous all the time, I couldn't be a two. Or if I didn't do this, I couldn't be a two. And again, I think twos are more complicated than is sometimes presented. And I've said this many times, but I never get tired of saying it, that twos get presented, in my view, by many teachers and books and representations too simplistically, as always wanting to help people or just looking for people who need them to feel a sense of importance. Now, certainly those are factors in type two, but a lot of twos recognize themselves as being more self-oriented. Like I kind of do want to know what's in it for me, And I think a lot of twos are also, um, the giving to get is a big blind spot, and that can make the picture more complicated. Yes, some of the times they're altruistic and generous, but sometimes they're kind of in it for themselves, whether they see that or not. But I think twos generally get mistyped as, of course, nines, sometimes threes. I think threes get all the credit for being super competent and productive, and I think twos can be that way a lot. All three subtypes of twos can be very competent and productive and hardworking. I think sometimes they get mistyped every once in a while as a one because they can have a kind of perfectionistic mindset. But with twos, it's a little bit more oriented toward wanting to be perfect for you or for someone to like me. I have to be perfect. And also sometimes fours, because they can tend to be more emotional. And sometimes the self-preservation too, I think, can be mistaken for a six. And I've said a lot, so now I want to hear what you think.
I think you actually said it all, the most important things. The only thing I would like to add is that in my experience, twos can become different depending on what the other person expects from them. and they might get confused with that, but it's a two feature similar to threes. And similarly, twos also sometimes don't want to be seen as being bad. And I'd say that if the explanation of who a two is particularly harsh, you will push away potential twos telling you that they are twos. I think that type 2 is one of the most sensitive to taking in, hard descriptions about them that won't make them look particularly good.
That's really important. I think sometimes twos can not want to own that they're twos because it feels humiliating to have people see kind of what's behind the curtain. I think twos, and it's the pride of the two, they so badly want to be seen in a positive light that if there's something that they sniff out in a description that sounds quote unquote bad or unattractive, they may resist owning their type, sometimes in ways they see and sometimes in ways they don't see. I think that's really important. And of course, I think we need to say that the social two can often be confused with three or eight, especially social eight. And that's a really important one that I've seen. And the subtypes help a lot with discerning between the social two and the social eight. And the sexual two, I think sometimes can get confused, especially with four. But sometimes, sometimes with three and eight as well. So shall we look at type 3?
Yes, please.
What would you say about threes? What issues are there in mistyping when it comes to threes?
Oh, one big issue is that threes become whatever you want them to be, like chameleons, and that is almost a definition of who a three is. So you need to be aware of that. Like the other day, I was working with someone in a company, a senior director of a big company, and on an Enneagram test, the person had come out as an 8. But it's because at a particular challenge that he had recently, becoming a CEO of one of the companies of the group, he had to play the 8 role, and therefore he replied to the test questionnaire as if he was an 8 because he was playing that role. But after talking with this person, we realized he was actually a 3 for different reasons. So threes can be mistaken for any other type. I remember seeing a nun who really thought she was a 1, but that was because her particular Christian order sort of expected her to behave and be like a bit one-ish, and therefore she could really misguide someone typing her as if she was a 1. So that can happen in multiple ways. So it's important to look behind behavior and to see if that behavior has always been like that or not in other circumstances.
Yes, I would say threes are really at the top of the list of the types that can mistype themselves and often get mistyped. Probably right up there with nines, but for a very different reason. And one of my teachers, Claudio Naranjo, used to say that Americans in particular are three blind, and this is because the United States is a three culture. And threes, as you're saying, become whatever is valued. And threes are often motivated to become whatever image in a particular context is seen as successful or admirable or valued. And so it's really easy for threes to see themselves in a very deep way as being another type, if that's the image that they have cultivated, as exactly as you're saying. And so I find that there are times when threes are mistyped for long periods of time, sometimes forever, when they are mistyped by other people, and when they just really don't see that what they've done is the identification process. And again, the identification is the defense mechanism of type 3, and it's a process where the 3 sees themselves as who they have identified with. They see themselves as an image, and they don't recognize that they are not that image. And so sometimes threes have a real struggle finding their actual type because they haven't yet learned who they really are, and they have a hard time self-observing that they have over-identified with the image and that they are not that image. And so I think that's a really important thing, and mistyping can be a hard process, or something that threes can fall into quite easily. Now I think there are some subtype things to say. I think threes generally can get mistyped, like you're saying, as almost any type. I think self-preservation threes often mistype as ones. I did a workshop once, and there was a woman there who had thought she was a one for a long time, and realized she was a self-preservation three. And I think a lot of threes don't realize what the options are, and they, in many of the books, the social three is the main three that's described. And same with me in corporate environments. I find a lot of self-preservation threes, and they sometimes don't relate to the description of the three because they don't see themselves as seeking recognition, or needing to win, or being competitive, or needing to kind of be the best, because they're more humble and they're more about being good, or doing the right thing, or getting the job done, and not being vain in any way. And so self-preservation threes, I find, often find themselves through the subtype descriptions, and same with the sexual three to some degree. It's a three that wasn't really on the map, both threes, before this subtype approach.
Yeah, another thing that leads to mistyping when it comes to type 3 is when the person works in the business setting and is goal oriented, fast paced, results oriented, and self promotes a bit more. But that's because these are all important things to do in that setting. And this is not a guarantee that you are a 3, especially if you have adapted yourself to do so, and if you have to force yourself to do so as part of the game.
Exactly. And if you, as a 3, sense that there are any traits that people don't see as admirable, you may not want to identify with that. And so there can be it can feel vulnerable, I think, for a 3 to actually find their type, and just hard to know. A little bit like 9s and 2s, sometimes we don't know ourselves, sometimes 3s don't know themselves from the inside, so it can be hard to say, oh yes, this is what I do, or this is what I am, or what I identify with, because of those blind spots. And I do think that sexual 3s often mistype as 2s, social 3s sometimes as 8s, and as we said, self-preservation 3s often as 1s, but also 6s, and other types as well. So shall we talk about 4s?
Yes,
What
let's
would
go
you
ahead.
say about 4s in terms of the way 4s can get mistyped?
I think that in the West, many for men get mistyped because they not necessarily show their emotions as easily as women do. Also, I believe that everybody from the East, like I'm talking globally here, like Asians, sometimes find it harder to see themselves as fours because the type 4 patterns might relate more to the inner experience, the inner world, rather than what they show out there, because it's not as easy to show and display emotions, or not as culturally expected or even accepted in some cases. So this is something to keep in mind. But from a more practical perspective, many times I believe fours get mistaken for eights, especially in the sexual subtype, because of the intensity, sometimes with threes because of the competitive streak, sometimes with nine, especially the social subtype, because of a low profile approach to things, and sometimes looking a bit shy, or with many other types in the self-press 4 case. But what do you think?
Yeah, I would say that that fours sometimes get mistyped. I guess it's hard for me not to see this mainly in terms of subtype, uh, because I think the three subtypes of four are so different from one another. I do see sometimes social fours getting mistyped as other types, sometimes sixes, maybe sometimes ones. I think because of the focus maybe on what's missing, or um, something that gets called fear that isn't always, that may be a kind of emotionality. Um, I think, of course, sexual fours get mistyped a lot because people don't understand the way the subtypes work with fours, and people don't recognize that when someone's, pretty easy with expressing anger and intensity, I think people go right to eight. But I think sexual fours are also people who are, pretty free with expressing anger and can be very intense and feel a lot of emotion. And then, of course, I think the self-preservation 4 is the type that probably gets mistyped the most of all 27. And we've talked about this before, but part of this is because the self-preservation 4 isn't, the description isn't really in very many places. And sometimes when I do typing interviews and the person ends up being a self-preservation 4, they say, well, where can I read more about this? And it's like I don't really have many places to send them. And I always feel a little bit embarrassed. As you know, I'm a little uncomfortable with self-promotion, saying, well, my books and our work in CP Enneagram. But that's really some of the only places, because although our approach comes originally from Claudio Naranjo, he hasn't written that much that widely about the subtypes. And so, but self-preservation 4s get mistyped as a lot of different types, sometimes as ones, sometimes as threes, sometimes as, probably less often, as fives, but even sometimes as sevens. And that might be an interesting mistype to talk about. I have seen fours mistype as sevens. Partly because they identify with the idealism and the creative visioning, and the self-preservation 4 in particular, but also a bit the sexual 4, can be have very active energy, be someone who really wants to explore the world, and someone who wants to look at the bright side, who often got the message that they should be happy. And also for the self-preservation 4, being happy or expressing more positive feelings can be a way of connecting with other people, or a way of working against being aware of envy.
Yes. Shall we move on to 5?
Yes, and why don't you say a bit about this?
I think many 5s get mistaken by 1s and 6s, but this is even more common for self-press fives. While the sexual five can be mistaken a lot for fours, and sometimes the social five also. And the social five can be mistaken for a three or even for a nine at times. And so it depends on subtype a lot, I believe, the mistyping of fives. Although, as you explain, the different subtypes of fives look alike. I mean, the three of them more than in other types like 4, 6, and 7. But I think it depends on subtype to see what the main aspects are for mistyping. But in general, I think that the problem with mistyping for fives is when you think of the five in an environment that they have already learned how to adapt. Because fives do adapt to being more communicative or a bit more out there. When it's needed, fives go do it with an interesting thing, which is a lot of regret in the inside for doing that. But it's not uncommon or even not too difficult for fives to adapt. And there is a thinking behind that, which is if I don't adapt, people will bother me even more and I will have even more trouble. So I'd better. And then they go do something about that. So you can see fives really playing roles, but differently than threes. They are always aware that they are playing roles. It's there isn't something like self deceit. It could be deceit of others though about that, and they don't sustain that role for too long, so it's something also typical. But mistyping happens when you get the five in one of those moments when the five is playing a role out there for whatever reason.
Yes, I think mistyping can happen a little less with fives because, like you're saying, they really know what's going on with them. A little bit the opposite of, say, nines or threes. They're often pretty clear on their inner experience and what they're thinking and doing when they're not adapting, as you say. And I really think it's interesting what you said about nines adapting, because I think that's probably a subtlety that a lot of people don't know about. But I've heard something very similar from a good friend of mine who's a self-preservation five. And she is someone who, one of the doubts I had about her being a five is she is very focused on her image. She always looks really good. She puts a lot of thought into the clothes she wears and the decor in her house. But she told me that a lot of it is for camouflage. So exactly like you said, so people don't bother her. Like she has this good image so that it's almost like she can fly under the radar, that people don't notice her sticking out in any way. They don't, she kind of can blend in and not arouse any undue attention. So I think that's a really important one. But she was really clear from day one that five was her inner experience. I do think fives can often get mistaken at times for sixes, and sometimes fives can have uncertainty themselves. Am I a five or a six? Because there's a similarity in ways of thinking. I know that one question we often ask when we're trying to tell fives apart from sixes is the worst case scenario question. I also think fives get confused with ones a lot, in that they can look very similar, especially on the outside. Um, and every once in a while, as we said, fives and nines, I think, can get confused. But I think sexual fives oftentimes can think they might be fours and can really have a hard time saying, am I a self-preservation four, like a four that kind of puts somewhat of a lid on my feelings, or am I a sexual five who's more five but has more access, at least especially deep inside, to my emotions? And I think social 5 can look a bit like 7 because they tend to be more out there, and the social instinct makes them comfortable on stage or working on behalf of social causes, talking more frequently and in more detail about what they're thinking and how they feel very passionately about certain things. But what else would you add to that?
No, I think that's it. I think um, we just need to really consider also the motivation behind someone being more quiet. It's not because the person is more quiet or seeks for privacy that they are a 5. There are other types that can do that, sometimes out of being just introverts, or in other times because they are shy. And for 5s, it's not as much being shy. It's really more a need to protect oneself and be private. But I think we said most of it.
So what about 6s? What would you say about 6s? What are some common mistypes of 6s?
So 6s can, first of all, doubt to the end if they are 6s. They can put it in question once more and again. Uh, and it's a pattern that almost helps us validate that they're 6s. And 6s can see themselves as being 1s a time or 3s a time, sometimes 9, sometimes 5s or 7s. So I think it varies more. Sometimes 4 because of the so-called pessimism, which is questionable. But there are many sorts of confusion for 6s, and I do think that there are a big number of mistyping occasions with 6s in general. But what do you think?
Yes, I think you're really right in emphasizing the doubt that 6s have, or the continual questioning that is their habit. And this can be applied to their type. It's like, well, am I sure I'm this type? I do think that 6s they can get to a sense of certainty because they can be very good at seeing the type patterns in action. I think one confusing factor is the fear element. Sometimes 6s have a hard time identifying with the fear piece that is so important to their character structure because they don't call it fear, or they haven't experienced it as fear, or they've experienced it so much that it's such an ever-present kind of experience, but again, they haven't put the label fear to it. So sometimes I think that can be hard in recognizing themselves in the descriptions. I think I see 6s the most often mistyping as 1s, and I think sometimes it's the self-preservation one. The social 6 can look a lot like social 1. So I think that 1s can be a mistyping. 3s, I think, can be another common mistyping. And sometimes I think this is because, 6s have an arrow line to 3. And I think some 6s, whether as a response to stress or as part of the way they can get really hardworking in response to needing to manage things in their life, including fear. So I do think 6s can get confused with 3s because they can be very hardworking, and especially under certain conditions, can look a bit like 3s. So I see that as another big one, and 5s to some degree, like we talked about when we discussed type 5 itself. So one more thing to say about 6 and lookalikes is the sexual 6 can often get mistyped as an 8. And again, this is the counterphobic 6. This is the 6 that copes with fear through being scary or intimidating or aggressive. And so I think that's one of the biggest mistypes of all in the whole Enneagram. So it's important to recognize that this is a 6 that doesn't always relate to the fear part, which is a big differentiating factor between 6s and 8s, because 8s are much more fearless. And while sexual 6s don't always feel the fear with awareness, it's usually almost always operating underneath. So let's talk about sevens. What would you say are key mistyping issues when it comes to seven?
I see many times that sevens don't want to be put in boxes and they want to say, oh, but I'm also like that, and also a little bit like that. So it's almost like there is an unconscious resistance against typing itself. Someone saying that I'm only one thing. And that's because of the passion of gluttony. Uh, but other than that, it's not a monopoly of sevens to be happy, and even at times sevens are not evidently happy. So the idea is here to be able to just differentiate between the basic things behind being a seven and the more outer traits that exist in many other types also, like being positive. And that sometimes leads to mistakes. Also, many people avoid suffering. It's not only sevens, it's more a question of the degree to which they do it and how afraid they are of suffering, and in multiple cases in their lives, and suffering of different kinds. So that sometimes leads to mistyping. And finally, it's not because you're active, dynamic, and like changes that you're a seven. There are many other types that can be like that. So make sure that you stick to the passion of gluttony, to the need of multiple alternatives, and other features that describe sevens better.
I do think one of the main mistypings for sevens is with three. I think threes and sevens can look a lot alike on the outside superficially. They both tend to like to keep up a fast pace, and they can enjoy their work, and they like to make things happen. I do think a big difference is, of course, that threes are very good at focusing in, especially on like one goal at a time, whereas sevens have more difficulty focusing their attention. And because they think of so many things at once or so quickly, their mind skips from one thing to another. They have less of ability to really focus in. I think sometimes sevens can mistype as fives, and which reminds me, we haven't really said this so far, but I think it's implicit in a lot of what we've said is often the arrow lines can be a source of mistyping. So you can be a seven that's maybe either in a particular period in your life or just as a theme throughout your life. You've identified a lot with five, or maybe you had a parent that was a five, or so for some reason you are more five-ish. Sometimes the arrow line from one type to another can be a source of mistyping. You can identify a lot with that arrow line connected point. And similarly, I've heard just lately, just this week, of a seven that thought she was a one at first. And again, it's they can also be very opposite, one and seven. But I think that those are also common mistakes. And interestingly, every once in a while, and I'm always surprised when I see this, but sevens misidentifying as fours. And I think it's a little bit of a wannabe thing. I think sometimes some sevens want to be fours because the four is intense and creative. And especially from the seven point of view, there can be a little bit of a kind of a feeling of adventurousness around the four. What else would you say about specific, maybe subtype mistakes that can happen?
Well, I think social sevens really see themselves sometimes as twos or nines. And that is something to bear in mind. And self-pressed sevens can see themselves as threes, and some other types also. And sexual sevens can see themselves a little at times as fours, I think, but also I think in a way they are the ones who find out they are sevens the easiest.
I do think that self-preservation sevens sometimes also wonder if they're sixes because they tend to feel a bit more anxiety and fear than the average seven. And I've seen self-preservation sevens be a little bit five-ish as well, but not so often. That's not the biggest mistype. It's time for our top five.
What is our top five today, B?
Our top five today is the types that are most fun at parties.
I like that. Although I usually suspect that you create top fives that will leave fives out.
Well, I didn't do that consciously, but perhaps unconsciously, I'm doing that passive aggressively somehow. But I wasn't aware of any intention in that direction.
Okay, yeah,
Okay.
it's an interesting thing. I thought of, that made me change my mind twice while I was thinking of what types would be on my top five for several reasons that I'll disclose. But
I know I'm still doubting my order
mhm,
in the top five up to this moment. So
yeah,
I don't have 100% confidence in this, but I think it's fun.
yeah,
And I do think that one thing I want to say is that some people think that certain types are always extroverted or always introverted, and I don't think that's true. I think any type can be introverted or extroverted. So this isn't necessarily about extroversion, but certainly there's probably an element to that, to being fun at a party.
yeah. And I also think that many times people are not the same at parties. And then there are situations in most parts of the world that, like, people drink and then they become someone else. So, it's a limited amount of time and a, somewhat controlled situation. And sometimes people bring their alter egos and, other sides to, enjoying a party. So people might be a bit surprised with some of the results. But let's see. What do you think? What is your number five?
So my number five is type six. And this is because I think sixes often have very good senses of humor. And they are often people who are making jokes and who are clever. And so that was my thinking, is that sixes can be fun at a party because they're naturally humorous. What
Yeah.
about you?
Well, my number five is type three. I think that threes many times can relax a bit more when at parties, and yet, just a few threes, not most of them, are the ones who really initiate fun per se. It's like they can do fun for some time, but I don't think it's their forte, the main thing that they can do. Although I think that's perhaps sexual threes at times can do that more, especially in parties, although they are a bit more shy, you know.
Yep.
So yeah, it's interesting. It's not the most one, but it's in the middle, so it's my fifth. And your fourth, which is
So my fourth is twos.
mhm,
I'm thinking twos are often very fun at parties. They like to be around people. Uh, they can be charming and fun loving, perhaps especially self preservation twos, such as myself. I do love a good party. But, I know that also sometimes twos can get overwhelmed by social situations. So I wouldn't say they're necessarily at the top. Sometimes they can lose themselves in parties because there's so many people that they may want to connect with and impress. It can get a little too much. But I would say twos can tend to be fun at parties.
Yeah, twos are also my fourth here, and I agree with you. I think they are usually positive and even fun. I think that I took the word fun on this top five a bit literally, meaning that, to me, it's when people say things that are different, get a bit unconventional. So I didn't think twos would be even higher on the table. It's more like they are positive and nice, and they are flexible, loose, and they go along with positive stuff that is happening more than what I considered being fun per se. But I do think that they deserve a place on the top five, at least for me.
Yeah, I think twos like to have a good time. I think especially self-preservation twos can get mistaken for being a seven. They tend to be a little bit hedonistic and fun in that way. I also think social twos like to host parties. So I've heard many social twos saying they really like to have a good party. So that can be another angle on it.
Yes, yes.
So what's your number three?
It's type one. Um, I see that many times ones are really funny, and perhaps they don't know how funny they are at times. Um, Sometimes when they try to be funny, they are, but most of the times they are funny when they're not trying, and it's so nice to see places and times when ones can relax that inner critic and be a bit more loose and say stuff before self controlling. And I think that happens in parties, and I've seen many times ones being very funny in situations like this.
I think you're really right. I didn't put ones on my list. I'm a little bit sad to say, but I really hear you. I think that parties can often give ones permission to break out of their normal routine a little bit and to let loose and to relax, and I think especially healthy ones can be very funny, and exactly like you're saying, they can really show more of who they are beyond the kind of serious level that they may put on during normal times that are sort of non-party times. Let's
Yeah,
say. Yeah,
yes.
yeah.
What about you?
So I put number nine at number three position. I was thinking of I have to say, I was thinking of some of the nines I know personally. So maybe that's a smaller data set. But some of the nines I know are very fun. They like to connect with people. They're humorous, like inherently humorous. Um, and easygoing and fun to be around and enjoy connecting with people and add a certain element to a party that I think is kind of fun in a very grounded and natural way.
Interesting. Yeah. And what is your second B?
So my second is type 8, actually.
Mm-mm.
Yeah. And I think eights, because they have a lot of energy and because they enjoy people and they have a sort of lust for life, let's say, often they can really enjoy indulging or being with people, and like their big personality can come out at a party and add a lot of fun to the atmosphere. That's kind of what I was thinking. What about you? What's at your number 2?
I certainly see what you said about eights, although I haven't included them. I don't think I thought it was like some eights and not a total pattern, but I hear you. Yeah. And my number 2 is type 6. I think that sixes have a great humor, usually. And sometimes at parties, especially after, some time, they uh, they're just brilliant. The stories they tell and how they interact with other people. They are very quick-witted, um, and I love the kind of humor that sixes have, which is smart, sometimes self-deprecating or critical of others, but in a humorous way. Um, yeah, so and I think that there are so many stand-up comedians who are sixes. I don't know if you agree with this or not, but it's my impression. And so yeah, sixes on my second place.
Yeah. Yeah, I agree. As I said, I had him at the 5 position. I think because I think some sixes I know can be a little bit more serious uh, and have a harder time loosening up. But I do fully agree with you. And I think you make a good argument for them being at the second position.
Yeah. And I think we probably agree on number 1.
Yep, I think probably so. What did you put?
Type 7. I was thinking, would it be a little bit of stereotyping saying that sevens are the funniest? But I do think they are usually. I think parties are one of the favorite moments and places for sevens, and they are very spontaneous. And I see my son, who's a 7, and 7 friends of mine. I have memorable passages with a close friend of mine who's a 7 in parties from different times in our lives. Really unforgettable passages. And I think sevens can be really, really fun. But is this also your number 1 or not?
Yes, it is my number 1. And it's funny because I immediately thought of a very good friend of mine who's been a friend for a long time, and he's a 7. And he often says, quite humorously, that he's fun at parties. It's kind of one of his jokes. And he indeed is fun at parties and loves a good party and often starts the party or makes sure we get it on the schedule. And I just think sevens are naturally suited to party environments. Now, certainly there are probably some sevens out there who are a bit more introverted, but I think most sevens come alive and enjoy a party, and some may even live for parties. And I'm thinking also another friend of ours who is an American who lives in Greece, and she's done quite a bit of Enneagram work there. And she has Enneagram cocktail parties. And
Mm.
I thought it was funny that she even turned sort of Enneagram panels and studying the Enneagram into a party. So yes, 7 is at my number 1 spot.
Yeah. And I just want to say that all other types can be really fun at times. I know some fours who are like showmen, really, and really fun at parties. I just don't think it's as much a standard for type as in other cases. But even fives, even I can be fun at parties here and then, like we do that party in one of our retreats. That how do you call it? Come as you're not. No?
Yeah, come as you aren't.
Yeah. So we need to play another character, and I think I can be sort of fun doing
Oh
that.
my gosh, sort of fun. At our last one, I have never laughed so hard as I did when I watched you during that party, because you came as a heart type. and you were wearing a red heart that you'd cut out of paper, and you had written on it something like, can I help you, please? Or something like that. And the look on your face, and a lot of people don't know that you are an excellent actor,
Am
because
I?
you really stayed in character, and you were so funny. The look you had on your face and the way you were acting, it was hilarious. So I do have to say, it would definitely be a stereotype to say fives are not fun at parties, because fives are definitely fun at parties, and you're proof of that. However, I do think that sometimes fives may not be always up for the party. And it reminds me of the T-shirt that I just sent you as a late Christmas present.
Yes, it's wonderful. Although
uh,
embarrassing also. Yeah.
yeah. Can I
Will
tell
you?
people what it
Yeah,
says?
go
Yeah,
ahead.
it says, I found a T-shirt that I had to buy and send to Uranio, and it says on it, is whatever this is almost over? Because so often when we're traveling or doing different things, you're looking at me like, can I leave now? And so
So if
yes,
you
and
want your five in your life to be fun at parties, agree beforehand how long you are going to stay in the party. And then you'll have a very fun five with you.
yes, and I'm glad you said that. That of course, any type can be fun at a party. It's an individual thing, but I think, as we like to do for our top five, we did make some. We made some statements about at least what we think are our opinions on this.
Yeah, it was a good one.
Yes. Okay. It was a fun party talking about who's fun at parties. All right. So thank you for listening. Join us again for our Enneagram 2.0 podcast, where we talk about all things Enneagram.